The city of Los Angeles is a patchwork of different worlds stitched together by endless freeways. In one world, there were bright lights and roaring crowds, the smell of sweat and leather, the echoing crash of bodies hitting the canvas. This was Ronda Rousey's world. She knew its sounds by heart. But tonight, her car glided away from that world, toward a different part of the city, where the noises were swallowed by old, spreading trees, and the only light came from the soft glow of street lamps on manicured hedges. She'd been invited to a salon. The word felt foreign in her mind. It wasn't her scene, but the invitation had come from a friend of a friend, someone who'd said, "Just go. It's an experience." Arthur Layton is different. Arthur Layton. The name meant little to her until she'd looked him up and seen a white-haired man with kind, sharp eyes, his fingers frozen over piano keys in 100 photographs. A classical pianist, famous in a way that was quiet but deep, like a well. Her curiosity, that thing that had always pushed her to try the unfamiliar, had gotten the better of her. So she went. The house was not flashy, but it had a quiet weight to it. It was set back from the road, built of old stone and dark wood, looking like it had grown there. She walked to the door, feeling the difference in the air. It was still like the calm before a storm, but a different kind of storm. She wore simple clothes, but she still felt like she carried the octagon with her, an invisible energy of aggression and readiness that seemed too loud for this quiet street. The door opened before she could knock. A man, not much older than her, with a gentle smile, welcomed her in. "Ms. Rousey, we're so glad you made it. Mr. Layton was hoping you would." The inside was warm. Books lined the walls, not for show, but for reading. Their spines were cracked and worn. The air smelled of old paper, polished wood, and the faint, sweet scent of candles. Low chatter hummed from a room ahead. She saw people, maybe 20 of them, holding delicate glasses, speaking in soft tones. They were artists, she guessed, writers, a couple of actors she recognized from serious films, a few people with the thoughtful look of Professor's Dot, and then in the corner of the large room was the piano. A grand piano, its black surface a pool of darkness reflecting the warm light. And beside it, in a worn velvet armchair, sat Arthur Layton. He was older than his pictures, but the eyes were the same. They didn't just look. They seemed to absorb. They found her the moment she entered, and a small knowing smile touched his lips. He didn't get up, just gave a slight, slow nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't dismissive. It was patient, as if he'd been waiting for a piece of a puzzle to arrive. And now, here it was. The evening unfolded like a slow, gentle river. People performed. A young woman with a violin played a piece that made Rhonda's heart ache without her knowing why. A man read a short poem about light on the ocean at dawn. Through it all, Rhonda stood near the back, leaning against a bookshelf. She watched, she listened. Her body, usually coiled with a need for movement, was still. She was observing a different kind of fight, she realized. A fight to capture a feeling and put it out into the air for others to share. The discipline felt familiar. The focus was the same, but the weapons were different. Her eyes kept drifting to her own hands. They rested at her sides, those hands that had been taped and wrapped 1,000 times. They had grabbed collars, blocked strikes, and tapped shoulders in victory. They were tools of control, of precision force. She looked at the pianist's hands when he finally, slowly, made his way to the bench. They were slender, veined with age, but they looked strong in a different way. When Arthur Layton played, the room vanished. It wasn't just music. It was a physical thing. The first notes were so soft, they seemed to pull the silence tighter. Then the melody rose, complex and powerful, flowing through the room like a visible current. Rhonda felt it in her chest. It wasn't a punch. It was deeper. It vibrated in her ribs, behind her eyes. She saw stories in the sound, not clear pictures, but feelings. Loneliness. A fierce, soaring joy. A deep, unresolved sorrow. She didn't understand how notes could do that. She just knew they did. She watched his hands. They were a blur, but a controlled one. They leapt and landed, pressed and caressed. They commanded the giant instrument with an authority that was absolute, yet gentle. It was the most beautiful display of power she had ever witnessed. It left her breathless. For a woman who had spent her life defining strength as the ability to force another human to submit, this was a revelation. This was strength as the ability to force an entire room to feel. After the final note faded into a respectful, awed silence, people mingled again. Rhonda stayed put, processing. The noise in her head, the constant buzz of training and competition, had gone quiet. She felt calm in a way she rarely did. It was then that he approached her. The room seemed to part for him. He moved slowly, with a slight stiffness, but his presence was immense. He stopped before her, looking up slightly to meet her eyes. "You felt it," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like the lowest key on his piano. She nodded, not trusting her own voice. "I've watched your fights," he said, to her surprise. "Not for the violence, for the hands, the way you use them. There is a language in them, a terrible, beautiful language of necessity." Rhonda didn't know what to say. "It's just what I do." "No," he said softly, his eyes gleaming. "It is what you are, and what you are has another side, a counterpart." He glanced toward the piano, then back at her hands. "Power like yours isn't a single note. It's a chord. You've only been playing one part of it." He reached out then, not to shake her hand, but to place his own aged, delicate hand over her fist. His touch was cool, dry, and surprisingly firm. "You have said everything you can say with those hands in one way. It is time they learned to speak another tone." A nervous, disbelieving laugh escaped her. "Me? Play? I don't know the first thing about it. I'd break the keys." "You would not," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. It was the voice of a man who had spent a lifetime understanding the limits of things, and he saw no limit here. "The music isn't in the piano, child. It's in you. The piano is just the amplifier. Your hands already know discipline. They know rhythm. They know the cost of a single, perfect moment. They just need a new map." He squeezed her hand once, then let go. The touch felt like a brand. "Next week," he said, and it wasn't a suggestion. It was a simple statement of fact, as inevitable as the sunset. "You will come back, and you will play for us." He turned and walked back toward his chair, leaving her standing by the bookshelf. The invitation hung in the air, not as a request, but as a challenge thrown down. And Ronda Rousey, her entire life, had never been able to walk away from a challenge. The roar of the crowd was gone, replaced by the echoing memory of a melody. The world of force had just collided with the world of feeling, and she was standing right at the point of impact. She looked at the piano, a silent, hulking beast, and then at her own capable hands. "Next week." The next morning, in the bright, quiet space of her own home, the whole thing felt like a strange dream. The soft candlelight, the old man's intense eyes, the weight of his hand on hers, it seemed to belong to another world. Here, in her kitchen, with the sun streaming in, reality was different. It was about sore muscles, protein shakes, and the clear, simple goal of the next training session. Playing the piano? It was a ridiculous idea, a funny story to tell friends. She pushed it to the back of her mind, but by the afternoon, a stubborn little thought kept nagging at her. Next week, he had said it with such absolute certainty. It wasn't a hope. It was a prediction. And he hadn't asked her to be good. He hadn't asked her to play a sonata. He'd said, asterisk, the music is in you. What did that even mean? 2 days later, a large, flat box arrived at her door. No return address. She brought it inside, sliced the tape, and pulled back the layers of foam. Inside was a simple, elegant keyboard. It was sleek and black, about 3 octaves long, with a power cord and a small stand. It wasn't a toy, but it wasn't the grand beast from his living room, either. It was a tool for beginners. Tucked under one of the keys was a crisp white card. On it, in a flowing old-fashioned script, were just 5 words, asterisk, asterisk, 5 notes. Just find 5. Asterisk, asterisk, that was all. No instructions. No sheet music. Just the keyboard sitting on her floor, and those words. She stared at it. Part of her wanted to push the whole box into a closet and forget about it. This was a world she didn't understand, a language she couldn't speak. She was a fighter. Her hands were for gripping, for controlling, for finishing. They weren't for this delicate, confusing dance on little white and black keys, but another part of her, the part that had learned an armbar when everyone said it couldn't be done, the part that had stepped into a cage when no other woman had, saw it for what it was, a challenge. And Arthur Layton, in his quiet, unnerving way, had thrown it down. She couldn't ignore a challenge. It was against her nature. With a sigh, she set the keyboard up on its stand in a spare room. She plugged it in. It gave a soft, digital hum. She pulled over a chair and sat in front of it. Her hands, resting in her lap, suddenly looked huge and clumsy. She lifted her right hand, extended a finger, the index finger that had pointed at so many opponents, and pressed down on a white key near the middle. Plink. The sound was small and electronic, but clear. It hung in the empty room. It didn't mean anything. It was just a sound. She pressed the key next to it. Plink. A slightly higher sound. She tried a black key. A sharper, different tone. She began to press keys randomly, creating a messy, clattering noise. It was awful. It sounded like a child banging, or like things being broken. Frustration, a familiar fire, started to burn in her chest. This was stupid. She was a world-class athlete, not a kid taking music lessons. For a few days, she avoided the room. The keyboard sat there, silent, accusing. She'd walk past the door and feel its presence. Asterisk 5 notes. Just find 5. Asterisk, the instruction was maddening in its simplicity. How do you find a note? What were you even looking for? One evening, after a long and grueling training session, her body ached with a deep, satisfying tiredness. Her mind, however, was still buzzing, replaying a sequence she'd drilled. She walked past the spare room, stopped, and went in. She didn't sit. She just stood over the keyboard, looking at the neat row of keys, not her hands hurt. Her knuckles were sore. She thought of the feel of the mat, the grind of daily discipline, the isolation of the path she'd chosen. Without thinking, driven by pure physical feeling, she lifted her right hand and let it fall, not with a finger, but with her open palm, across a cluster of low white keys. THWUMMM. The sound wasn't a plink anymore. It was a crash. A deep, rumbling, discordant boom that vibrated through the stand and into the floor. It wasn't pretty. It was raw power. It was noise. But it was also a feeling. It was the sound of her exhaustion, of her frustration with this whole silly task. And for the first time, the sound connected to something inside her. Intrigued, she did it again, in a different spot. Another jarring, powerful chord. She tried a closed fist, pressing down. A darker, more muffled sound. She wasn't playing music. She was using the keyboard like a piece of gym equipment, testing its limits. But in doing so, she was discovering its voice. The low keys felt like strength, like a foundation. The high keys felt like a shock, a surprise. Over the next few days, she returned, not to practice, but to experiment. She'd hit a low cluster with her left hand, and then, with one finger of her right, pick out a single, stark high note. Boom, plink, boom, plink. It created a space. It felt like a heartbeat, followed by a thought. It felt like waiting, then acting. It felt, strangely, like fighting. The setup, the strike. She never found a melody. She found sounds that matched her mood. A rapid, skittering run of high notes when she felt agitated. A slow, pressing down of a single deep key when she felt thoughtful. She wasn't following any rules. She was just mapping her insides onto the keyboard. The night before she was due to go back to Arthur Layton's house, she sat in front of the keyboard for what she told herself was the last time. She had nothing to play. No song. She had just these fragments, these emotional sounds. It wasn't enough. Panic, a cold and unfamiliar sensation, began to creep in. She was going to sit in front of all those people, in front of that wise old man, and fail utterly. She would look foolish. The warrior, defeated by a piano. The frustration that had been simmering for a week boiled over. This wasn't her world. She was forcing a square peg into a round hole. In a surge of anger, she leaned forward, raised both hands high above her head, and brought them down with all her controlled strength onto the center of the keyboard. It wasn't a smash meant to break it. It was a declaration of surrender. Crash, bang, woohoo. Every key under her palms and forearms sounded at once. A terrifying, glorious, all-consuming wave of sound filled the room and shook the walls. It was the loudest, most chaotic thing the little keyboard could possibly make. It was every feeling at once: anger, fear, pride, stubbornness, and a deep, desperate want to connect dot as the sound died away. Leaving a ringing silence in her ears, she sat there, breathing heavily. Her hands stung. And then a calm settled over her. In that chaotic, violent chord, she had been completely, brutally honest. There was no technique. There was only her. She looked at the keyboard, then at her hands. She had found her 5 notes. They weren't pretty. They weren't correct. But they were hers. They were the low rumble of effort, the high sting of pain, the middle note of doubt, the cluster of discipline, and that final, crashing chord of raw self. She unplugged the keyboard. The challenge was no longer about proving she could play. It was about having the courage to let that chaotic, honest sound out in front of others. She didn't know what would happen tomorrow. But she knew, now, what she would do. She would start with that crash and see where the silence after it took her. The car ride back to that quiet part of town felt entirely different. Before, there had been curiosity, a sense of stepping into an unknown world as a visitor. Now, there was a low, steady hum of dread in her stomach. It wasn't the fear of a fight. There was a clean, sharp feeling she knew how to use. This was heavier. This was the fear of profound embarrassment, of revealing a part of herself that was clumsy and unformed. She had left the small keyboard at home. Tonight, she would face the real thing. The grand piano in Arthur Layton's living room was not a piece of plastic and wires. It was a living thing made of wood, steel, and history. It demanded respect. She felt like she was walking to her execution, not a performance. The same soft light glowed from the house windows. The same gentle man opened the door. But the feeling inside was charged, different. The guests were there, the same mix of artists and thinkers, but their glances toward her were longer, filled with a palpable curiosity. Word had gotten around. The famous fighter was going to play. Some looks were kind, encouraging smiles. Others were thinly veiled skepticism, the look of people expecting a car crash they could politely clap for afterward. Arthur Layton sat in his same velvet chair. He didn't smile when she entered. He simply met her eyes and gave that same slow, deliberate nod. It felt like a signal. The stage is yours. For a while, the evening proceeded as before. A poet shared a piece. A cellist played something haunting and beautiful. But a tension built underneath it all. Everyone was waiting for the main event, the bizarre experiment they'd all been invited to witness. Rhonda sat stiffly on a small sofa, her hands clenched together in her lap. She listened to the cellist's flawless technique, the smooth, trained emotion, and her heart sank. That was music. What she had was noise. Finally, the last polite applause for the cellist faded. A silence fell, deeper than before. All eyes, gently but insistently, turned to her. Arthur Layton did not stand. He simply gestured with an open palm toward the piano bench. "Whenever you're ready," he said, his voice a soft rumble in the quiet room. It felt like a mile between the sofa and the piano. Her legs moved stiffly. The floorboards creaked under her weight, a sound that seemed deafening. She reached the piano. Up close, it was even more immense. The lid was propped open, revealing the intricate maze of golden strings and hammers inside the guts of the beast. She carefully slid onto the bench. It was firm. The sheet music stand was empty, a blank page waiting for a story she couldn't write. She placed her hands on her knees. They looked alien to her, these tools of violence resting so close to the elegant ivory keys. She could feel the gaze of the room like a physical pressure on her back. Her throat was dry. Her mind, usually so focused in chaos, was a white blur of panic. All the little sounds she'd practiced at home vanished, wiped clean. All that was left was the memory of that final crashing chord of frustration. "This is stupid," a voice in her head screamed. Get up, make an excuse, leave. But another voice, quieter and deeper, spoke. It was the voice that had walked her into a stadium to face a champion. Asterisk, you showed up. So see it through. Asterisk, she lifted her hands. They hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. She glanced at Arthur. He was watching her, his face unreadable. He gave the faintest nod again, not of expectation, but of permission. She closed her eyes. The room disappeared. The people vanished. It was just her, the dark behind her eyelids, and the feeling in her chest. She remembered the exhaustion after training. She remembered the solid, unwavering thump of her own heartbeat in the quiet moments before a fight. She let her left hand fall, not with fingers poised, but with the weight of her whole arm, onto the lowest set of keys. Boo-oom. The sound was nothing like her keyboard at home. It was oceanic. It was a deep, fundamental vibration that came up through the bench and into her bones. It wasn't a note. It was the earth itself groaning. The room flinched at the sheer physicality of it. Before the sound fully faded, she did it again, establishing a slow, deliberate rhythm. Asterisk, boom. Silence, boom. Silence. Asterisk, it was a primal pulse. A march. A heartbeat from the center of the world. Then, with her eyes still shut, she raised her right hand. She didn't think of melody. She thought of a single sharp thought cutting through fatigue. A flash of pain. A moment of clarity. She let one finger her strong, calloused index finger strike a single high, white key far to the right. Ping. The note was like a shard of glass. Clean, bright, and lonely against the dark rumble of the bass. It hung in the air. A question. Asterisk, boom. Ping. Boom. Ping. Asterisk, she fell into the space between them. The deep sound was everything that was heavy in her life. The expectation, the grind, the weight of her own name. The high sound was the pinpoint of action, the split-second choice, the sting of a hit taken or given. She varied the rhythm. Sometimes the high note came fast after the boom. Sometimes she made them wait, building a tension in the silence that had the room holding its breath. She wasn't playing a song. She was building a structure of feeling. She added another low note with her left thumb, a different one, creating a simple, shifting foundation. With her right, she began to use 2 fingers, then 3, not to play a scale, but to cluster notes together, little tight knots of sound that felt like confusion, or bursts of effort. The sounds were simple. A child could have played the individual notes, but the way she played them, with total physical commitment, with the weight of her body and the memory in her muscles, transformed them. The piano was no longer just an instrument. It was a sparring partner. She was working with it, feeling its resistance, finding its rhythm. She forgot about the audience. She forgot about Arthur. She was in her own world, a world made of vibration and emotion. Her face, usually a mask of controlled intensity in the cage, was alive with expression. A frown of concentration. A slight wince as she struck a cluster that sounded like conflict. A brief, almost peaceful softening in the moments of silence between the heavy beats. She didn't know how long it had been. A minute? 5? Time had melted. Her piece found its end not with a fancy flourish, but with a decision. She brought both hands back to the low end. She played her deep heartbeat note one last time, letting it ring out. And then, with her right hand, she reached up and struck not one high note, but 3 close together, a final, complex, unresolved sound that was neither happy nor sad, but simply true. It was the sound of a story still being written. She let the last resonance fade into absolute quiet. Then, and only then, she opened her eyes. The silence that followed was not an empty one. It was a thick, living thing. It was the silence of a breath held too long, of a spell not yet broken. The final, unresolved chord seemed to hang in the air long after the strings inside the piano had stopped vibrating, leaving behind a phantom feeling, a pressure in the ears. Rhonda's eyes focused slowly. The room swam back into view. The books, the faces, the warm light. But the faces were not as she had left them. The polite masks were gone. Every person was sitting perfectly still, frozen in whatever moment the sound had caught them in. A woman near the front had her hand clasped over her mouth, her eyes wide and glistening. A man with gray hair was staring at the floor, as if he'd seen something profound in the pattern of the rug. There was no smiling, no nodding. There was only shock. A deep, personal, rearranging kind of shock dot. It wasn't about the music. Anyone with training could have heard 1,000 technical faults. It was about the raw, unchecked truth that had just been funneled through the piano and into the room. They had not heard a tune. They had felt a life. Then a small sound. A gentle clink. On the sidebar where the drinks were, a crystal water glass began to tremble. Its thin rim started to hum, a faint, high-pitched ringing that harmonized strangely with the memory of the high notes. Then another glass joined it. It wasn't loud, but in the profound quiet, it was unmistakable. A low, subsonic vibration, the tail end of that massive bass note, was still moving through the old house, making the air itself feel dense and charged. No one moved to stop the glasses. They just watched, listened, as the physical world confirmed what they had already felt in their chests. Arthur. Leighton had not taken his eyes off Rhonda. Tears, clear and unchecked, traced slow paths down the wrinkled landscape of his cheeks. But he wasn't sad. His face was illuminated by a kind of awe, the look of a miner who has struck not just ore, but a vein of pure, radiant crystal. He was seeing the proof of his life's quiet theory, that power was a spectrum, and true strength at one extreme could speak the language of the other. The sound of the glasses faded. The living silence returned, but it was beginning to soften, to thaw. The first person to move was the cellist who had played earlier. He stood up slowly, as if waking from a dream. He didn't walk toward Rhonda. He walked toward Arthur. He leaned down and took the old man's hand, squeezing it, unable to find words. He just nodded, his own eyes bright, and then he left the room, needing to be alone with what he'd heard. This broke the spell, but not into chatter, into quiet, purposeful movement. People began to approach Rhonda, not in a crowd, but one by one like pilgrims. The woman who had covered her mouth came first. She didn't compliment the playing. She took Rhonda's still hands in her own, which were cold and trembling. "My brother," the woman whispered, her voice cracking. "He was a Marine. He came home. Quiet. He never talked about it. But that sound in the middle, that tight, tangled knot of notes you played, that's the sound he carried in him. Thank you. I felt him just now. I finally felt him." She moved away, and a man, the writer, took her place. "You built a room out of sound," he said, his voice low with wonder. "And you put us all inside it. I don't know how. I was in a concrete basement from my childhood. I could smell it." He touched his own chest. "It's all still here." One after another, they came. They spoke not of technique, but of memory. A professor said he'd felt the relentless pressure of his first PhD defense. An artist saw the color blue, a specific lonely twilight blue she'd been trying to capture for years. Their experiences were all different, but the core was the same. Her simple, forceful sounds had acted like a key, unlocking private rooms inside of them they'd forgotten how to enter. Rhonda sat on the piano bench, stunned. She had braced herself for polite, pitying applause. She had been ready for failure. She was completely unprepared for this, for total, vulnerable recognition. She didn't know what to say. "Thank you" felt too small. So she just listened, holding their gazes, nodding, sometimes squeezing a hand in return. Her fighter's instinct to protect, to be a fortress, melted under this wave of shared humanity. She had walked in feeling like an imposter. Now she felt like a mirror. Throughout this, Arthur watched from his chair, a peaceful smile on his face. He was not surprised. He was satisfied. His experiment was a roaring success, but the result was more beautiful than even he had dared to hope. Eventually, the room emptied, people leaving softly, carrying the experience with them like a precious, fragile gift. The helper who opened the door saw them out, leaving Rhonda and Arthur alone in the warm, quiet space. The only evidence of the shock wave was the empty chairs and the 2 water glasses on the sidebar. Now perfectly still, Rhonda finally stood up from the bench. Her legs were shaky. She felt drained, but in a clean way, like after a hard, honest workout. She walked over to Arthur. He looked up at her, his old eyes gleaming. "What?" Rhonda began, her voice hoarse from tension and emotion. She cleared her throat. "What was that?" "That wasn't music." "Oh, but it was," he said softly. "The oldest kind. It wasn't about telling a story someone else wrote. It was about letting the story inside you find a shape. You gave it a shape they could feel in their bones." He pointed a bent finger at her, then at his own chest. "You didn't play for them. You played from here. And because you did, it reached here, in them. You made a bridge." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper, as if sharing the most important secret in the world. "The shock in this room, it wasn't surprise at you. It was surprise at themselves. You reminded them that underneath all the thinking and talking, we are all just feeling creatures. You reminded me. You played a single true thing. And a single true thing is the most powerful sound in the world. It shakes more than glasses, my dear. It shakes souls. Rhonda looked back at the piano, the giant, elegant beast that had seemed so intimidating. It didn't look like an adversary anymore. It looked like a companion, a confessional. She understood now that the room's shock had never been about her lack of skill. It was the shock of witnessing something raw and real in a world that often preferred things polished and safe. She had come here to prove she could meet a challenge. She was leaving having learned that the real challenge and the real victory was in the courage to be heard. The heavy door of Arthur Layton's house clicked shut behind her, sealing away the warm, charged air of the salon. The night outside was cool and ordinary. The quiet street was just a street again. But as Rhonda walked to her car, she knew nothing was ordinary. She felt light, ungrounded, as if the deep vibrations from the piano had shaken something loose inside her, and it hadn't quite settled back into its old place. She drove home not with the radio on, but in silence. Her mind wasn't racing. It was wide open, replaying the faces of the people who had spoken to her. The woman's brother, the Marine, the writer's concrete basement, the tears on the old man's face. They hadn't seen a fighter pretending to be an artist. They had seen a person, and in seeing her, they had remembered pieces of themselves. It was the most intimate exchange of her life, and it had happened without a single throw or strike dot at home. She walked past the spare room. The small keyboard sat on its stand, a silent monument to her week of frustration. She didn't go in. She went to her living room and sat in the dark, looking at her hands resting in the dim light from the window. They were the same hands. Scars, calluses, the slight crookedness of a finger that had been broken and taped back into service. For over a decade, their purpose had been singular, clear as diamond. Seek control, apply force, secure victory. They were tools of dominance. But tonight, those same hands had done something utterly different. They had sought connection, not control. They had offered feeling, not force. And the victory felt different, deeper, quieter. She didn't become a pianist. She didn't start taking lessons or dream of concert halls. The world of perfect technique and complex sonatas was still Arthur's world, not hers. And that was okay. He hadn't wanted to make her into a copy of himself. He had wanted to show her a door inside herself she didn't know was there. A few days later, a simple handwritten note arrived in the mail, the same flowing script. Asterisk, the amplifier is always here for you. Remember, the music is not in it. It is in you. Thank you for the gift of your truth. L. Asterisk, she framed the note. It wasn't a trophy. It was a reminder. Life returned to its rhythms, the grind of training, the focus of competition, the noise of the public world that knew her only as the fighter. But something had changed. She found herself listening more to the sounds of her gym, not just the punches, but the rhythm of the jump ropes, the grunt of effort, the specific silence of concentration. They were all a kind of music. She started to notice the weight of silence before a big moment, not as an empty space to fear, but as a canvas. The most profound change was in how she viewed her own strength. Before, strength was a wall. It was the thing that kept everything out, that protected the vulnerable core, that enforced her will on the world. It was unyielding. Now she began to see another side of it. The strength to be vulnerable. The strength to express something messy and real. The strength to resonate with other people on a level deeper than words or victories. That was a strength that didn't build walls. It built bridges. It wasn't about making someone else feel weak. It was about making them feel understood. She visited Arthur one more time, a month later. She didn't play. She just sat with him in his garden. They didn't talk much about music. He asked about her training, and she found herself describing it not just as tactics, but as a feeling the flow of movement, the geometry of the cage, the sudden opening moment for a submission. He listened, nodding, and said, "You see? You are already describing it as an art. The language is different, but the soul of it is the same." She realized he was right. The discipline, the repetition, the pursuit of a perfect, truthful expression in a single moment, it was all the same journey. She had just learned a new dialect. Years would pass. Her life in the public eye evolved, with new chapters and challenges. Through the highs and the inevitable lows, the moments of criticism and noise, she often thought of that night. When things felt chaotic, she would remember the power of finding just a few true notes. When she felt misunderstood, she remembered the shock on those faces, not of judgment, but of shared feeling. She never gave a concert. But sometimes, in private moments of great emotion, after a hard loss, during a time of personal transition, in a moment of deep joy, she would sit at a piano if one was near. She wouldn't try to play a song. She would close her eyes, find the feeling stuck in her chest, and let her hands translate it. A low rumble of grief, a bright, skipping cluster of happiness, a slow, steady pulse of determination. It became a kind of journaling, a way to process the world that was entirely her own. The ripple from that night never really stopped. She heard, through mutual friends, that the cellist had written a new piece dedicated to the unexpected musician. The woman who spoke of her brother told Arthur it had begun a healing in her family they hadn't thought possible. The shockwave in the piano room had traveled out into other lives, in small, unseen ways. For Ronda, the greatest gift was a new kind of wholeness. She no longer saw herself as just a fighter who had dabbled in something strange. She was a person of intense physicality who had discovered that her intensity had another voice. The power to break and the power to create were not opposites. They were neighbors in the same house. You could walk from one room to the other. The bridge between them was courage, the courage to be honest, to be seen in a raw and unpolished way. One evening, many years later, she was speaking to a young athlete who was struggling, who saw their worth only in wins and losses. The kid was all sharp edges and defensive anger, a mirror of her younger self. Ronda listened, and then she told them the story. Not about fame or pianos, but about the challenge from an old man, the fear of the unknown, the frustration of the keyboard, and the terrifying, liberating act of making a sound that was purely, imperfectly true. "They don't teach you this in training," she said, her voice calm and sure. "But your strength isn't just one thing. It's not just the thing you show the world. It has a whisper, too. And sometimes that whisper can shake a room more than a scream ever could. Don't be afraid to find your whisper." The kid looked confused, but curious. A seed was planted. Ronda knew that was the real end of the story. It wasn't about a magical performance. It was about the lesson that stayed, the new layer it added to her spirit. The famous pianist hadn't compelled Ronda Rousey to play the piano. He had compelled her to listen to the music that had always been playing inside her. And once she heard it, she was never quite the same again. The room had been shocked into silence, but she had been shocked into a deeper, more resonant kind of life.